Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Ray. I'm a detransition male, and today we're going to be talking about how autogynephilia broke through to the mainstream. um, because if you did not know, Joe Rogan, 5 hours ago, he published an interview with JD Vance, and the episode already has 2.5 million views. And in the video, Joe Rogan explicitly talks about autogynephilia and brings it up. So it's just so interesting to me how this concept has become so niche, or it started off as such a niche thing that like only nerdy, sexologists or like academic specialists in like the field. So yeah, let me. So Ray Blanchard, he published on Twitter. He posted on Twitter, in response to this Joe Rogan thing talking about autogynephilia. He said, "My early writings on autogynephilia were published in specialty journals." With limited circulations that were intended for a small readership of clinicians who specialize in the assessment and management of gender dysphoric patients. The general availability of the internet in the home and workplace was still several years away, and access to print journals for people unconnected to major universities was difficult. I therefore had no expectation that the readership of my autogynephilia papers would ever extend beyond the small group I had originally envisioned. So yeah, and like, so going from that about, small print journals of like, specialized clinicians working in like specialized gender clinics to the biggest podcast in the world talking about autogynephilia. So as someone myself who is interested in educating people about what autogynephilia is, I want to watch this and sort of give my reaction to see how it's discussed, how it's characterized, mischaracterized, whether they get things accurate or not. So it starts, I think they first mentioned it around 38 minutes into the interview, but I'm going to start at like 35 minutes and just so we can catch like the full context of the topic.
If you can call it a mind virus or whatever it is, it does make people behave religiously.
Yes.
So it's like they're ignoring all of these signs because it doesn't line up with this ideology that they subscribe to.
That's right.
Like you have to support trans kids. Like, okay, what are you even saying? How is this a new thing so pervasive? How is it everywhere? And how are you letting them compete with girls in school? That one drives me bananas. When you have biological males, all they have to do is.
Let me actually back up a little bit because you might have started talking about the trans stuff even earlier than this. I'm going to back up just a few minutes before that.
Want their kid to be a part of the LGBTQ thing because it looks like to gay kids. These kids will just grow up to be gay men. No toxicology report.
No, and
no one talks about it on the news.
Right. And when there's this,
I like didn't realize he talked like that much about the trans issue. So I'm gonna back up even further and we'll just watch this like whole thing and react to it.
School shooter, we usually have the person's manifesto out there a day or two later.
Yeah.
We know nothing about the motive here, which I think is the craziest thing. I'm obviously he's motivated because he hates Donald Trump, but you don't know anything about the secondary motive.
Also, who wants to put bets on JD Vance being a AGP repressor? I would take that bet for sure.
Man, it is weird. It is
The only
really
time we
weird.
don't get a manifesto is when they're trans. When they're trans, they hide those
That's true.
manifestos.
The Nashville shooter, man, that was crazy.
Have you ever read any of it?
I've read some of it.
It's
and
pretty wild.
It's pretty wild.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, that
And they
guy,
decide that's bad for the cause.
that's
so
right.
they decided
They
cover it
decided to
up.
suppress it. But no, the Nashville shooter, I mean, just while we're on the topic, went in and murdered a bunch of children at a Christian school because he or she, like whatever, was motivated by some very radical trans ideology.
Yes.
And that is something we should talk more about as a country.
100%. And they didn't want, if there's any other ideology that led someone to mass murder, you would examine that ideology very carefully. It was some sort of radical religion. People would be like very concerned about that radical religion.
That's right.
And it is. It's the radical religion of
That's
woke.
exactly what it is.
It's
That's
this
exactly what it
weird
is.
idea that you are so virtuous and so correct. You're allowed to commit violence against these other people because they're the oppressors, even though they're children.
Well, you know, these signs that are in super woke neighborhoods, I'm sure there's plenty of them in Austin. Like, in this house, we believe science is real. No person is legal. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Okay. So I don't know your religious background, but like I'm a convert.
Yeah, it's so ironic. They're like, in this house, we believe science is real, but also autogynephilia is pseudoscience and debunked, and also like we all have lady brains.
To Catholicism. It's like, was raised Christian, became an atheist, came back to Christianity, got baptized Catholic like 5 or 6 years ago. And what is so interesting about this in this house we believe is it's so similar to the creed that you declare every day at a Catholic mass, right? We believe in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God. And there's almost a similar cadence between the Christian creed and what these guys are doing with this hyper woke stuff. And then there's the rallies, and then there's of course the various rituals, and it absolutely is a religious faith.
So I have a video on my channel. Let me see if I can find it. I did this like a while ago, actually, where I talk about sort of like the analogies between gender ideology and like a cultic indoctrination or like new age religion. I've done a couple of videos on that topic before, and I always thought that was like an interesting analogy in terms of like the recruitment. So yeah, I'm not gonna find it, but yeah, I have several videos on my channel somewhere. Oh yeah, 10 signs gender identity ideology is a cult. that's one of my videos. So yeah, this video here, 10 signs gender identity ideology is a cult. That's actually one of my favorite videos that I get like a lot of flack for making that analogy. But I don't know. I mean, there's some pretty strong parallels.
There was this really interesting post that was, I forget exactly who wrote it, but the title was "Gay Rights as," what was it? It was like gay rights as religious rights, but the second rights was RITES. And it was a guy who was like a pro-gay rights guy, but sort of made the observation that when you get into the really radical trans stuff, you actually start to notice the similarities between a practiced religious faith and what these guys are doing.
Yeah.
And
I can't believe this is a conversation happening by the vice presidential candidate is talking about the religious, ritualistic, Gnostic nature of trans ideology. I mean, that's like such an esoteric like topic of conversation. I mean, that's like, yeah, I mean, like you like kind of gotta be like invested in the discourse to understand that. And so I sort of suspect JD Vance knows a little bit more about the gender discourse than would be normal for a heterosexual man to know about that discourse, if you get what I'm saying.
And it's very interesting. I mean, I actually met earlier with a friend who lives in Austin, who's like a, you know, kind of a gay Reagan Democrat. And
Whoa.
he's a very, very interesting guy. He's a fascinating guy. He's one of the smartest political philosophers, I think.
How do you be a gay Reagan Democrat?
But on the other hand, there is a lot of there's been a lot of like work recently from like conservative religious scholars, sort of like deconstructing transgender ideology. Let's see, Carl Truman. So this book here, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism, and the Road to Sexual Revolution. Basically, it's like this, you know, really long book exploring the historical and philosophical, you know, underpinnings of like the ideological and philosophical machinery necessary in our culture to make it conceptually possible to say things like trans women are women. So I could see JD Vance like reading a book like this, you know, and then like a lot of, you know, Christians are becoming interested in transgender ideology because of, you know, if you're like super duper Christian, then like, you know, you believe in literalism. And so like the Bible says, you know, man created male and female. And there's sort of like a immutability of like sex. So like the immutability of sex is like an important like theological like doctrine. And also like if you really get into like, you know, evangelical literalism, then like you have literalism about like Leviticus, for example, which says that men ought not to wear women's clothing and women ought not to wear men's clothing. And so you get into like the ontological grounding of like gender roles into like, you know, religious authority or something like this. So yeah, a lot of, and like also like if you are, you know, a hardcore Catholic or like a fundamentalist evangelical, then typically you also have like a certain theological position on like the morality of like homosexual behavior. So yeah, it does. So I do see why people like JD Vance like are interested in this topic of like transgender ideology, because it like kind of cuts across all these like philosophical, ethical, cultural things. Joe's view of AGP is horror. This is what happens when trans people pretend it doesn't exist, while the gender criticals who defined AGP for the culture at large. So I'm going to get to Joe Rogan's interpretation of like autogynephilia. Like I didn't think it was like as terrible as it could be. I thought it could have been like a lot worse. Totally. Just jumped ahead and watched the whole clip, breathing a sigh of relief that this was nowhere nearly as bad as it could have been. Yeah, I'm just going to jump ahead because I just want to get it over with and talk about it.
Right. Like I'm the father of a 2-year-old daughter. I want my daughter to learn these important life skills. I don't want her going into athletic competitions where I'm terrified she's going to get bludgeoned to death because we're allowing a 6'1" male to compete with her in sports where you should not have biological males competing with biological females.
Not only that, but they get to change with them in the locker rooms. That's where it gets like there was one in Canada where a 50-year-old man identified as a teenage girl. He was a professor.
All right. Yeah, that was actually like a crazy case. That was actually an insane case. Canadian professor swimming trans girls. Yeah. 50-year-old trans swimmer shared locker room while competing against teens. The girls were terrified. So like, this is what people talk about. Like, you know, this is why self-ID is a terrible idea. It's just it's so politically toxic, and also it's just not fair. That is not right. It's not right. Like men should not be in these spaces, particularly in this case, which is almost certainly motivated by paraphilic interest. A 50-year-old transgender swimmer was allowed to compete against teenage girls at an event in Canada, with horrified parents building a makeshift tent out of towels to shield girls as young as 8 in the locker room. Melody Weishart, who once competed under the name Nicholas Cepeda, sparked outrage while competing during the Trojan Cup in Barrie, Ontario. The girls were terrified. An unidentified parent of one of the teenagers told the Toronto Sun of having to share a locker room with a much older trans swimmer. It's also confusing for the kids. No one is comfortable. Everyone is accepting of all people, but them swimming against our kids and being in a locker room with them is not appropriate. Weishart, a professor. That's crazy to me. She has reportedly been competing against girls since 2019. No, I'm sorry. If you do this creepy shit, you don't deserve she, her pronouns. Like, I usually am like pretty good about using preferred pronouns to people, but like if you're a sex pest, then no. You don't deserve she, her pronouns. I'm sorry. So he has been competing against girls since 2019. Yeah, it's just crazy.
He was changing. He was in a swim meet with teenage girls.
Yeah.
And he's changing in the same locker room as them. And then
it's crazy.
The problem with that is people, there's a psychological condition called autogynephilia. And autogynephilia is where men are sexually aroused by the idea of dressing and behaving like a woman, but they're heterosexual.
So technically he's correct. So like at least Joe Rogan is able to like provide the technical definition of what autogynephilia is. Even though there are a lot of nuances to that, particularly once you really get into the sexological nerdiness of breaking it down to the different subtypes of autogynephilia and explain the sort of nuances. But at the most basic level, he did get it right. And also, notice how he called it a psychological condition. Like, to me, that is like a good thing that he used that sort of language, because he could have said autogynephilia is when you are a deviant, immoral, perverted fetishist and you get off on imagining yourself as a woman. He described it as a psychological condition. And as a psychological condition, that is at least a sort of like morally neutral framing in terms of like, this is a condition, it's a psychological condition. So he could have framed it much worse. And he sort of, so at least he got that right. And he didn't immediately prejudge it by sort of adding in moralistic language in regards to like, defining it as like necessarily as like a immoral perversion of like some kind or another. So I thought that was at least good.
Now all of a sudden, these people with this known psychiatric disorder are allowed.
He calls it a psychiatric disorder. I mean, technically, that's kind of true insofar as all paraphilias are atypical. And you could say that like having an atypical erotic interest is sort of like non-normative in some sense, or at least how Ray Blanchard defines paraphilia is like you're born with a defect, an innate defect that causes you to have a higher risk factor to being predisposed for erotic mislearning. That erotic mislearning in childhood through the developmental processes and our childhood experiences, the erotic mislearning that develops these paraphilias like a foot fetish or AGP is the internalized attraction, where your heterosexuality becomes misdirected. So you have a mislearning, a miswiring in your brain such that a normal process somehow gets, broken, like the mechanism breaks in some way. And so yeah, actually, I'm going to keep playing this, but I need to let my dog in. So I'll be right back.
allowed to just identify as a woman, and you're a bigot if you don't let them change in the women's
and
room.
you're expected to empower them at the expense of young women who are very often much more vulnerable for obvious reasons than young men. And it reminds me of, so the very first congressional delegation trip that I ever took was to Paris. I think it was to Paris, and it's part of the Paris Air Show, and Ohio has all these, aviation interests. And anyway, long story short, I was talking to a very conservative woman at the Paris Air Show who was from Mississippi, and she was probably 65, 70. And it was really interesting because I was just like, how do you find the city? She'd never been to Paris before. And I'm just, interested in people. So I was asking her, and she said, what's really interesting is I just feel like Paris, I would think of as very liberal, but I actually think Paris is more conservative than some of the big cities in the United States. And I said, oh, tell me more about this. And this woman doesn't know me very well, and she's clearly kind of embarrassed to tell me, but she walks through, she says, well, I just don't see any people, like when you're in Paris, the girls are girls and the boys are boys. And that's true in Paris. And that's not necessarily true in some of our big cities. And then she says, she says, Senator Vance, I'm embarrassed to tell you this, but when I was in New York City recently, I saw a grown man who was walking around in a mini skirt. And then she gets very quiet and she said, Senator Vance, I could see his balls.
He probably wanted you to see his balls.
And you realize.
Yeah. See, Joe Rogan is right. He wanted you to see his balls. And like also, Danny, you are correct. I don't think a man in a skirt showing his balls is AGP. It's some other paraphilia. So that paraphilia would be exhibitionism, the sort of the thrill of like exposing yourself. But I don't think it's incompatible with AGP. I do think there are some AGPs who may also, in addition to having the paraphilia that is autogynephilia, they might have an additional paraphilia of exhibitionism. But exhibitionism obviously is not like intrinsic to the phenomenon, and the vast majority of AGPs like don't have that additional paraphilic interest of like exhibitionism. And also it may not necessarily be exhibitionism, because it could just be a total lack of self-awareness on part and due to being autistic and having a wardrobe malfunction. Because I've seen a number of Huns, AGP Huns in real life who just have like complete obliviousness to like themselves. Like there's some sort of like defect in their interoceptive processing, like their self-processing, that they just don't have a good like objective sense of like how they come off to other people. So in that sense, like he could have like tried to be tucking and then like his tuck slipped and his balls are hanging out, but he couldn't like notice that his balls were hanging out because of like he's autistic and lacking self-awareness or something. I don't know. Maybe that's like a stretch, but I'm just saying that like, some of these AGPs are just like super autistic and like they just don't have any have any self-awareness. Have you considered getting on testosterone? You mean like testosterone replacement therapy? I take a drug called Clomid, which is a drug that it boosts testosterone by inhibiting something in your pituitary gland, which is used to treat male infertility. So it's not, I'm not injecting testosterone, but after I detransitioned, I had low testosterone. I was like at like the very lowest end of the normal male range. And so, yeah, I'm taking this drug called Clomid, which sort of naturally boosts your testosterone through manipulating inhibitory mechanisms in the pituitary gland. Interestingly enough, Clomid is also used to treat female infertility. So the same drug treats both female infertility and male fertility, and male infertility. So yeah, and like now my testosterone levels are in the normal male level. So for the past couple weeks, I've been on like the carnivore diet, giving that a shot as like a elimination diet. So far so good. I really like it. I feel great. Anyway, back to the show.
Yeah.
Oh my God, this is not empowerment. This is not respecting lifestyle choices.
Right.
We're letting a grown man walk around in a miniskirt in broad daylight. Like, what are you talking
I feel like
about?
you should be.
So that has nothing to do with like transgender policy and everything to do with the more broader sexual libertinism that has come down from the sexual revolution. So that is not something specific to transgender ideology. That is just like a downstream consequence of the sexual revolution to sort of like and like that's just an issue of like advocating for stronger public decency laws and like enforcement of public decency laws and like not having the like policing resources to enforce public decency laws, because there's literally like millions of people in New York City and like there's tons of freaks and geeks and all kinds of stuff. So it's like, how do you like police that when you just like, you know, you put that many freaky kinky people in like a like dense urban environment? You're going to see like some pretty weird stuff.
Be allowed to wear a miniskirt. If a girl
Oh wait, I want to go back.
are sexually aroused by the idea of dressing and behaving,
The boys are boys, and that's
it's empowering.
Yeah.
And because like
and they expect redemption, but no, they don't get forgiveness. Led me back to my own faith, but I sort of just and you realize, oh my God, this is not empowerment. This is not respecting lifestyle choices.
Right.
We're letting a grown man walk around in a miniskirt in broad daylight. Like, what are you talking about?
I feel like you should be allowed to wear a miniskirt. If a girl can wear a miniskirt, you can wear a miniskirt. That's not what bothers me.
But
what bothers me is if I have to see your balls.
To flash people.
See, that's like Joe Rogan being based. See, that's like the libertarian spirit. I love that. So I absolutely agree with like Joe Rogan. And this kind of goes back to the whole like the blue dress gate of Jen Speck with Phil Illey and like the blue dress and like, the whole controversy of like and if you don't know, there's this gender conference and you know, Phil Illey, who is a self-aware, self-identified autogynephile, he wore like a blue dress to the conference, didn't have any problems, didn't use female spaces, doesn't use female spaces, doesn't claim to be a woman, he knows he's male. And so all the things of J.K. Rowling's famous gender critical Rowling call of wear what you want, express what you want, love who you want, but like, you know, just acknowledge that like sex is real and stay out of women's spaces. So it's like, that's been like the rallying cry for the gender critical movement for, you know, so many years is like, you know, we don't care what you dress like, you know, wear a dress if you want, do whatever, just stay out of female spaces, stay out of female sports, blah, blah, blah. But this sort of blow up with the blue dress at Jen's back, with the self-identified autogynephile wearing a dress, there's this huge discourse that launched that is still ongoing to this day. This discourse is still actively happening. And I, to some extent, I have been brought into this discourse myself as someone who's defending Phil. But the argument now from some segment of the gender critical world is that it is okay for a gay guy to wear a dress. It's okay for a gender nonconforming straight man to wear a dress to express fashion. But if you are a straight man who is also an autogynephile, then it's not okay to wear a dress if you're an autogynephile, because the idea is that you're involving other people in the public display of your fetish. Like they say, you're getting off on wearing that dress in public, and so like other people being forced to like look at you is like somehow violating their consent because they didn't consent to participate in like your in your fetish or whatever. So it's like that's like the argument. And in this case, you know, Joe Rogan would like clearly align with the more like liberal position. The libertarian position was like, it doesn't matter what your like internal motivation is. It doesn't matter what your internal thoughts are. It's like we have to analyze behavior at the level of action. And so long as you are decent and you're not exposing yourself, you're not exposing your boner or whatever, you know, like, and you're not hurting people, and you're not, you know, violating, you know, other people's consent by like touching them inappropriately, or like exposing your genitals or something, or like using female spaces, like, then in public spaces you ought to be able to wear what you want. So if a man wants to wear a miniskirt, as long as his balls aren't hanging out, then like that should be okay. Whereas I think JD Vance, you know, being more conservative, being more Christian, his sort of gut reaction is like, that's going too far. And like, you know, gender bending in public is like, you know, somehow not allowed. And I think part of the reason why this opinion is popular is because these sort of gender bending in males has sort of become associated with trans women. So it's like you see a man in a miniskirt, and your first thought nowadays is not like, oh, that's just like some transvestite or some crossdresser. You say like, oh, that must be a trans woman who identifies as a woman and uses female spaces. And so now I'm expected to like share a locker room with this person, you know, share like the changing room with the 50-year-old, you know, professor who, as like a swimmer, shared a room with like teenage girls. So it's like, so yeah, like I think that's sort of like this sort of dividing line between the sort of conservative instinct to basically kink shame, to sort of say that shame serves a regulatory function and that we ought to be shaming all this stuff, because without that social regulatory mechanism of shame, then, you know, we present essentially a safeguarding risk. So unless we're actively shaming gender nonconforming in males, particularly if that gender nonconformity derives from an underlying paraphilic interest, then like you know, it's yeah. And I sort of see this as like this sort of moralizing, or this attempt to like say that like, oh well, if you're gay, it's okay to wear a dress because, you know, your motivations aren't paraphilic. You know, versus like if you're AGP and your motivations are paraphilic, then it's not okay to wear the dress in public. Well, the problem with this is, how do you know what someone's motivations are? How do you know whether someone's motivations are driven from homosexuality or from paraphilia? Because the problem is the paraphilia of autogynephilia, which is an internalized attraction. There's this phenomenon related to autogynephilia called meta attraction, such that you have misdirected heterosexuality, such that you're aroused by the idea of being treated as if one was a woman. So you're attracted to women, but you're aroused at the idea of being treated like a woman. Well, one of the ways that we sort of idealize based on these stereotypes in our culture, and also based on biological reality, is like to be treated like a woman. The quintessential sexual dynamic of being treated like a woman is to have your femininity validated by a man. So this generates what's called meta attraction. So you can be attracted to men insofar as the men validate your own sense of femininity. So if the man finds you attractive, that makes you feel good because you now know that you are feminine. And so that satisfies your internalized attraction, your desire to be perceived and treated as the opposite sex because you have this misdirected heterosexuality, this internalized attraction. And so that meta attraction can be so strong that it actually, on the outside, at the surface level, you could have a boyfriend and date a man, and be ostensibly, living a life as like a gay man. So there are cases where there are men who socially identify as gay, but their gayness is motivated by the underlying paraphilic attraction. So you say like, so the GCs, the like gender criticalist ones, like, oh well, it's okay to wear a dress if you're gay, but not okay to wear a dress if you're AGP. Well, the problem is merely by looking at like who someone is dating or whatever, or like who someone has sex to, you can't actually distinguish whether or not someone is truly homosexual, or whether their homosexual behavior is driven from the internalized attraction that creates meta attraction. I know it's theoretical, and I know like some of the mainstream sexologists like don't necessarily agree with that view, but within the sort of amateur sexology world and the amateur self-aware AGP world, like that is like the going theory right now, is that you can have seemingly ostensibly homosexual behavior that's driven actually from an internalized heterosexuality, which is sort of like a mind twist that you can think that. So this idea that we're going to be able to cleanly figure out in public which man wearing the dress is driven from a paraphilia and which one's driven from their attraction to men. Dakota says, I think there's a rational case for allowing nudity since we all were nude looking at each other for millions of years. Somehow there has to be a compromise. I mean, I have heard that in like certain like Nordic countries, for example, like they have a much like less of like a moralistic prudishness about nudity the way we kind of do here in like the States. Like nudity is like not as like overly sexualized the way it is here in the States. So like I think there might be some cultural relativity to like that. So yeah, I don't know. That's like an interesting question, but I don't see that happening. And like public decency laws are probably going to be on the books here in America for quite some time. The GOP wants gays back in the closet and transvestites sequestered to the drag bars. I mean, I don't think you can make a universal statement like that. I mean, there's a lot of people in like the sort of new Trumpian coalition that are of the classical libertarian mindset, where like, live and let live as long as you're not encroaching on the rights of other people. Or they have, there's like a lot of people in the new Republican Party. And I would count myself in that class of people who, are sort of abandoning the Democratic Party, moving towards the center right, but still fundamentally hold very liberal, classically liberal positions in regards to freedom of expression and like morphological freedom to modify your body, and freedom, so long as you're like a rational adult, and like, freedom to, like just like maximizing freedom. There's like a lot of like people in like that new Republican coalition where like their preeminent principle that they care about is freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and freedom of association. Like freedom is the ultimate value. Whereas I think the more traditional republicanism of the moral right, going back to like the like early 90s and this like, evangelical conservative coalition, the sort of Newt Gingriches of like the world, who sort of built that moral right coalition of like the sort of the Southern Baptist coalition of these like the moral right. I think people of that Republican background do have a more like authoritarian or sort of like not authoritarian, but like it's like more absolutist in regards to their position about like getting gays back in the closet, or that transvestites, we like don't want public transvestism, so like they would sort of try to legislate against like men wearing dresses in like public or whatever. But I couldn't tell you whether that's like the majority of like the modern Republican coalition. I just think there's a lot of people now who are like in that coalition who are like either politically homeless, they're like center left, but like feel abandoned by the Democratic Party. People like Tulsi Gabbard or like RFK Jr. who like just feel like abandoned by the Democratic Party. So they feel like they haven't moved right at all, just like the Democrats have like moved away from the traditional freedoms, because now the Democratic Party is associated with like censorship and like not believing in the First Amendment and stuff like that. So I think that so yeah, I would be cautious to like say that like the entire like anyone who votes for Trump or like Trump himself seems to be like more leaning towards that more classical liberal mindset of like live and let live, as long as you're not hurting anyone else, freedom to express yourself, love is love and all that stuff, the kind of more classic liberal position. Trump doesn't strike me as one of these like evangelical Bible thumper conservatives who has an absolute position on whether it's like morally right for like a man to wear a dress in public or something like that. So I just can't see Trump signing a bill that like bans public cross-dressing by males. I just don't see that happening at all. It doesn't seem like in line with anything he's ever done. He literally has gay weddings at his house. Trump has hosted many gay weddings at his house in Mar-a-Lago. So like, he does not seem like someone who's going to ban or try and put gays back in the closet. That just does not seem in line with Trump, in my opinion. If there is any scenario where you would consider retransition, well, it depends on what we mean by retransition. If we mean go on hormones, no, I would never go back on hormones. I mean, the only reasons to go on hormones mostly is like reduction in body hair and growing gynecomastia, man tits. So I was on hormones already for 8 years and I grew my man tits, so I still have them. So I don't need to regrow them. And then as far as the body hair reduction, you don't need to go on HRT to do that. Like I actually have been using this Braun 5 Silk IPL home hair removal system. And like I've been using that over the past like 12 weeks or something. And now my body is like pretty much almost as hairless as it was when I was on like hormones. So I don't need the hormones to have like that smooth body that hormone gives you. And now I can sort of like have like the aesthetic that I want from my AGP, but I don't have any of the downsides of like going on hormones, which there's many negatives to hormones. And also staying on hormones long term, unless you're doing estrogen monotherapy with injectables, which I didn't like doing the injectables, then you have to essentially go on testosterone blockers, and testosterone blockers long term is no good. So you have to get an orchiectomy. You have to surgically castrate yourself in order to like maintain this like hormonal state. And like I just didn't like that. And also like I like having the physical vitality and energy and creativity and strength and that comes with having my body run on the natural system that is meant to run on by testosterone. A lot of trans activists think that the male body is perfectly agnostic in regards to whether it optimally runs on testosterone or estrogen. They have this sort of like idea that somehow the male body could optimally run on either estrogen or testosterone, and it's totally arbitrary. But I think that there's no evidence for that. Total bullshit. Um, and like Mother Nature is smarter than us until proven otherwise. That's the sort of basic evolutionary logic. And based on that evolutionary logic, it seems obvious to me, and I can prove this up, that and I can cite studies to prove this, but the male body runs more optimally on testosterone in terms of physiological health. Now, I'm not talking about like your psychiatric, psychological interpretation of how you feel. I'm just talking about like in terms of the actual physiological, physical, medical health. You know, how is your liver functioning? How is your metabolism functioning? How is your energy levels functioning? How is your mental and cognitive sharpness? How is your brain fog? All these things, I think that at least definitely in my own personal experience, like running on testosterone is better. So yeah, I don't think I would like retransition hormonally. I have like zero, and also I literally had a pulmonary embolism from a combination of being on the oral estrogen and on the and having a history of smoking. And so I was on the patches, which is the safest delivery mechanism, and the patches were annoying as hell. I hated the patches. like, yeah, like, and like the idea of like wearing patches for the rest of my life. I mean, that's no fun. And the idea of like injecting myself every 2 weeks or whatever, and dealing with like the emotional dysregulation from having your like emotions like cycle like that, that's not healthy either. Like, I like being steady emotionally. I like being, you know, my sort of natural stoic self. I actually like that. I think that is one of the you know, good things about being male, is that, you know, I sort of have that natural stoicism that I think comes from the testosterone suppression of like emotional dysregulation, which prevents neuroticism and anxiety and stuff. So I'm much better mentally running on testosterone. And yeah, so, and then as far as like social transition, like, no, I would never do a legal name change again. True that. And I never want to construct an identity such that I'm putting an expectation on myself to try and pass as a female so that I can use female spaces, justify my usage of she, her pronouns, justify the usage of like a female name like Rachel going by, everyone calling me Rachel, everyone, you know, calling me she, her pronouns. And like, I like never asked people to use pronouns, and I never, ever corrected people with like pronouns. I would never, it was only if people naturally use them for me of their own volition. So I never asked people to use she, her pronouns, but nevertheless, because everyone knew that I was a transgender woman, or at least that's how I identified, or I was publicly identifying, then there's sort of this social script of like, if you're going to be a good progressive ally, a good liberal ally, then you have to use she, her pronouns. So it's like, in some sense, like the fact that I was like having that identity of a trans woman forced me to sort of live up to certain expectations in regards to feeling like I had to earn those she, her pronouns. For example, like, you know, I had like 11 or 12 rounds of laser hair removal on my beard, so that when I shave clean shaven, I don't have visible beard shadow, but still I had to shave every day. Otherwise, like a little bit of stubble comes through. And so I got really resentful of the fact that, well, it's been like a day or two, I haven't shaved, I have some stubble, and I want to like run up to Walgreens to get like, just to get something from the store just real quick. And it's like, well, I don't want to walk outside and have, and like run into a neighbor, and the neighbor sees me with stubble. And then now it's like, oh, well, I thought you were a trans woman. Like, aren't you taking your transition seriously? You know, I thought, you know, you're running around like calling yourself a woman, and yet you're like, you don't take your womanhood seriously enough to like shave. So it's like So I like resented that like putting myself in a box where like I felt like the identity of trans women, it didn't allow me fluidity of expression because I had to live up to the stereotype that like trans women care about passing as female. And obviously if you have visible facial hair, you don't pass as female. So I had to like always try and like, put up this pretense of like trying to pass as something that's not, even though I obviously didn't pass. So it was like this totally messed up thing. It created neurosis, it created social anxiety, and like it created double consciousness, self-consciousness, neuroticism. And like that was just, I just never want to go back to that. Whereas like now, if I want to be pretty, I can. If I want to dress up, I can. Also, if I don't shave for 2 days and I want to run up to Walgreens, I don't have to make myself try and pass as something I'm not. So in my sense, like I now have way more freedom of expression as a detransition male than I ever did as a trans woman, because the trans woman put me in a rigid box and I hated that. Sorry, it's been going on HRT, but still identifying as a guy, like being on HRT for Browski, looks like a woman, but acknowledges the brother. I mean, yeah, like for some people, like I like know of a self-aware AGP who is like on on hormones. But yeah, I just like, I don't like having slightly softer skin and like very slight levels of fat redistribution to like slightly, subconsciously change like, like a millimeter of like perception of my face. It's like, no, like, and it's funny, like, whenever I do my makeup really, really nice, and like I really like do like, I do super clean shaven, like do like a lot of foundation, make it really dewy looking and soft looking, and like put on a lot of like glowing highlighter and stuff. I always get like comments of like, "Hey Ray, are you back on the sauce?" So it's like, you don't need hormones to make it look like you're on hormones. You just need to have, a good clean shaven face, nice foundation, a nice dewy foundation, throw on some highlighter, and just like learn how to do makeup really well. And you can achieve that dewy look of the glowing hormone skin. And you don't, and also just moisturize. Like, people are like, oh, like, testosterone like ruins your skin. Like, well, moisturize. Most men don't moisturize. I moisturize every time I get out of the shower, my entire body. It's like I moisturize my entire body. I moisturize my face. Like, be smart about sun exposure. Like, just take care of yourself. Like, and that'll like make you, that'll like prevent you from turning into like a baseball glove, or like an old leather mitt. Just take care of yourself. It's not that hard. And I don't think slightly softer skin is like worth like the negative downside health effects of HRT. All right, I want to keep watching the JD Vance. We got like way on a tangent. That's a good questions though.
In broad daylight in New York City,
you're a pervert.
You're a pervert.
You're just a
pervert. If that's what you're doing, you're a pervert.
So I saw some people reacting to this. It's like, oh, like this guy with the miniskirt and his balls are exposed. It's like a pervert. And people are like, oh, like it's over for AGP self-awareness because like people are just going to associate autogynephilia with like perversion. But it's like, yeah, like this is the problem, because all of the AGPs that act badly, and there are many AGPs who act badly, they sort of form the cultural stereotype or the cultural archetype of like what AGP is. Because every time you see a gender bending male acting like improperly, being a sex pest, like doing creepy stuff, or like violating boundaries, violating female spaces, exposing themselves, like being creepy, doing like PDF file stuff, all that stuff, like it's like always like an AGP. But it's like you don't hear about all the AGPs who don't do all that stuff because they don't make the news. They don't go viral. They don't make a good story. You don't even notice them. They're just sort of blending into society as regular people, going about their day, So it's like we don't hear about and also the vast majority of autogynephiles are not trans-identified. The vast majority of autogynephiles are like your weekend warriors who just dress up once in a while in the comfort of their home, or maybe they just have extremely mild autogynephilia, and they just and that internalized attraction just motivates them to make trans pornography their favorite genre of pornography, or something like this. Or then they maybe they every Halloween they like to dress up as like a princess or something, but otherwise they don't ever develop strong enough dysphoria to motivate transition. So it's the vast majority of trans, or the vast majority of autogynephiles are just regular men that you'd never know, or AGP. They just have this secret life, and often they have a secret stash. The problem though is when the secret stash, the secret life, is when you're married and you're hiding it from your family, and your family doesn't know, and you didn't tell your wife going into getting into that relationship that you actually are a secret crossdresser or whatever. You have this kink, and so then if you actually do fall victim to trans ideology and go on to transition, that can blow up your marriage and ruin your marriage and all this stuff. So it's that's how trans widows get created. So that's why I push for self-awareness, so that people can prevent themselves going into these relationships without warning their a future partner that hey, this needs to be first date conversation. You should not be going on a second date without your potential partner knowing that you are an autogynephile, or that there's some risk of eventually transitioning. It's oh yeah, I have contemplated it. You need to be telling her those thoughts. So within my field of amateur sexologists, pretty sure so there's a lot of AGPs out there who are LARPing as HSTS, who talk a big game about being HSTS, but in reality they're just highly meta attracted AGPs who have strong autoandrophobia. So whenever people come on my channel and be like, oh, I'm HSTS, you don't understand it, it's almost always in 99% of cases just LARPing AGPs. For example, Brianna Wu claims to be HSTS, but clearly and obviously Brianna Wu is of the AGP ideology. And also, most HSTS do not spend their time watching live streams of AGPs and getting involved in online internet gender discourse and writing long comments and screeds on the internet about niche, sexological things. That is an AGP behavior. So it's the mere fact that you're getting so worked up defending yourself, defending the legitimacy of your HSTS identity, is proof positive that you actually are of the AGP ideology, and you're just in denial, and that your homosexuality, your attraction to men, is driven from your underlying meta attraction. So it's sort of just deeply ironic, but this whole HSTS LARPing is a coping mechanism, which stems out of a need for validation, because what could be more affirming of the AGP's need to validate their femininity than pretending that they're HSTS and sleeping with straight men. And so that's the ultimate AGP fantasy, is to be a HSTS. So yeah, I don't take any HSTS seriously. AGP until proven otherwise is my standard policy. So sorry, uterine. I don't think you're really an HSTS.
And I want all of us to say, whatever your political persuasion, just say, no, that's weird.
Right.
You're not allowed to walk down the street and flash children in the middle of the world's, or the America's biggest city.
So flashing children has nothing to do with autogynephilia. That's about public decency laws and the regulation of actually dangerous paraphilias, like exhibitionism, where you're sort of like, by definition, to act in that paraphilia involves a consent violation and a boundary violation. But it's fully possible to act on the paraphilia of autogynephilia without violating any boundaries. Like if you're just cross-dressing in your home, obviously, you know, you can consent to yourself being attracted to yourself or looking at yourself. So it's like, yeah, you can consent to yourself cross-dressing. And if you're just like wearing a dress in public and you're fully clothed and like decent, you're not exposing anything, you know, following basic public decency laws, like you're not hurting anyone. I don't think that it is inherently harmful to be forced in the public square to look at someone, to look at a man wearing a dress. Like, I'm sorry, this is America. We have freedom of expression. Like, if a man wants to wear a dress and, you know, secretly in his mind, he's getting some thrill about that, but otherwise he's perfectly, you know, like decent and not exposing himself in any way whatsoever. It's just like inside, he's like really euphoric about that. Like in America, the cost of freedom is allowing that in public spaces. Now, I'm not talking about going to female spaces, like protecting female spaces is totally different than protecting the common square, the public sidewalk, the public place. That is the conversation we're having. Walking down the public sidewalk in New York City, freedom of expression in America. This is America. Like, there's a cost to freedom. The cost of freedom is that you have to put up with people expressing themselves in weird ways or expressing themselves in ways that make you disgusted. It doesn't matter that you're disgusted by the man wearing the dress. That man has a legal right to freely express himself to do that. Just like if a conservative Christian is disgusted by two gay men walking down the sidewalk holding hands, that does not mean that that gay man or that conservative Christian's reaction gets legislated into law and that to try and protect their feelings or whatever. This is America, the land of the free and the home of the brave. We have freedom of expression. And also, it's just a misconception that most autogynephiles are walking around aroused all the time, because like that's like one of the biggest misconceptions with like autogynephilia is that like if you are motivated to cross-dress as an autogynephile, that you're necessarily just walking around with like in this like state of like arousal all the time. That's like not the case. It might be the case if you are only a transvestic weekend warrior, or you only go out en femme like every once a month or something, and it's like this big thing. And also there's a sub branch or a subtype of autogynephilia called masochistic emasculation fetishism. So for some AGPs, they experience, you know, their cross-dressing or their feminization as a emasculating thing, and because they have a additional paraphilia in addition to autogynephilia of masochism, that emasculation satisfies that masochistic drive. And masochism is actually pretty common in like AGPs, which motivates them to take on the submissive role in the bedroom because they want to invert traditional heterosexual dynamics, and they don't want to play that traditional heterosexual role because a lot of them have autoandrophobia, like they don't want to play. They have like a repulsion to playing that heterosexual role. I think that is connected to the drive for masochism. And then for some people, if like due to some childhood experiences, you have an association with like, you know, feminization and humiliation, that is a subtype. For most AGPs, the motivation to transition is not born out of masochistic humiliation, but because they actually like it. They just like it. It makes them feel good. It's not born out of like a desire for, you know, exhibitionism or like masochism. It's just like they just like it. And particularly if you are transitioned and you've been on hormones, you know, like your libido goes down often, and like you sort of morph into the more like romantic attachment side of things because and Lawrence's famous paper, Becoming What You Love, autogynephilia has both an erotic side and a romantic attachment side. So once you like get over the like initial novelty of like cross-dressing all the time, it eventually just becomes normalized. You get habituated to the novelty of the stimulus, and it's no longer arousing. It just becomes like wearing your like regular clothes or whatever. So prior to my trans identification, I was a fetishist, a cross-dresser. So I would, I would like cross-dress and have, masturbation rituals or whatever. But then once I transitioned and I was wearing women's clothing 24/7, like all that arousal stuff went away. It completely became de-eroticized. It was just like wearing regular clothing. It was not arousing to me whatsoever because I got habituated to the stimulus and because of the hormones, like that arousal factor, and it sort of like morphed into this more like romantic idealization of the idea of myself embodying femininity, but it wasn't like and like erotic internalized attraction. So yeah, there's just like a lot of misconceptions about autogynephilia, but I do think it's like fascinating that like this is like that like the term autogynephilia, and they're actively talking about autogynephilia. The vice presidential candidate and Joe Rogan, 3 million views in 6 hours, 3 million people are now learning about autogynephilia, and yeah, like. Are they going to come away with a nuanced understanding? Like, no, they're probably going to come away like with this idea that if you're an autogynephile, then you're like a pervert, and that you are going to be running around wanting to flash children, or you're going to want to like do all this like stuff, or you're going to want to like use locker rooms with like little girls and stuff like that. Like, so yeah, this is sort of like contributing to this idea that like all AGPs are predators. And this kind of goes back to a live session I did the other day where I talked about like, is there such a thing as like a virtuous autogynephile? And there's definitely like a big contingent in the or I don't know, big, little, there's some contingent in the gender critical world that wants to push for this idea that there's no such thing as a virtuous autogynephile, such that it is impossible to have this paraphilia and be a good person, to be a decent person, to not be a predator, to not be a risk of being a predator, to not, be like a PDF file, to not be an exhibitionist, to not be a voyeurist, to not have, be like a risk factor, or like, so they sort of think that like necessarily this is like, if you do have this paraphilia, then like, you're just a bad person. You sort of be shamed. You have to be ashamed of yourself. You just have to like, like never act on these feelings, or like total repression, like never, indulge anything. Just like, totally live up to like some masculine gender role, because if a paraphilic like indulges like a little bit, it's just like inevitably going to like escalate into, boundary violation inevitably or whatever, or they say it's connected to like narcissistic personality disorder. Which is what Jordan Peterson and Michael Schellenberger, psychoanalyzed about AGPs when they were having their amateur conversation, even though they don't really know much about it. Like Jordan Peterson said, like all AGPs that have narcissistic personality disorder. No, that's not true. So yeah, there's a lot of like misinformation in regards to autogynephilia. But my hope with this sorts of conversations is that people learn about autogynephilia and then they type it into Google. And then hopefully from SEO, they stumble across people like Phil Illey, who have a more scientific and rational and destigmatized conversation about what autogynephilia is, so that actual autogynephiles can recognize themselves in that phenomenon and become self-aware. Because if a autogynephile is listening to this conversation about this perverted man walking around with his balls hanging out, they're not going to be like, oh, that's not me. I must not be an autogynephile because I'm not a creepy pervert like that. So, and this is one of the main reasons why so many trans women lack self-awareness as autogynephiles, because there's such a strong social favorability hypothesis. So if you don't know, social favorability. So the social favorability bias, often referred to as a social desirability bias in psychological and sociological context, refers to the tendency of individuals to present themselves in a manner that will be viewed favorably by others. This bias can affect the way people respond to surveys, questionnaires, or in social interactions, where they might alter their answers or behaviors to conform to what they believe is socially acceptable or desirable, rather than providing truthful or accurate information. So based on conversations like this with JD Vance and Joe Rogan, like it's not going to be socially desirable to self-identify as an autogynephile, because you're going to be lumped in with these creepy perverts who expose their balls and like use locker rooms with like 15-year-old girls. So it's like no one wants to like take on that identity, even though from a scientific objective perspective, both that creepy pervert and also like regular trans women share the same underlying ideological factor, which is the paraphilia for internalized attraction. It's just like that internalized attraction as an underlying disposition and risk factor can manifest itself in a wide variety of different clinical presentations. It can manifest in your sort of transvestic fetishes. It can manifest in a transsexual who like hates her genitals and has strong autoandrophobia. It can manifest in like someone who just wants to be a femboy. It can manifest in many different ways. It's like a spectrum, and there's a lot of different subtypes. Samantha Lux thinks AGP is real now. Yeah, I'm starting to see a lot of people talk about AGP as real. They just don't ever say that it applies to them. So it's like you see this with Brianna Wu. So Brianna Wu is starting to acknowledge that AGP is real, but like, and she even says that she knows like some AGP trans women who are well integrated and like well adjusted and good people and stuff, but there's still this strong social desirability bias, this strong sort of confabulation, this strong sort of memory holding and retconning. It's very common. It's like Ray Blanchard noted in the empirical literature and the clinical literature for decades that trans women often confabulate their past narratives to present a social favorability bias, to present a narrative that supports the AGP idealization of the idea or the desire of wanting to be a woman. So you're going to always present yourself socially in a fashion that maximizes the chances of everyone else thinking that you're actually a woman on the inside and not a man with the paraphilic erotic interest of internalized attraction. So that social favorability bias drives the denial of the reality of the fact that autogynephilia is the underlying ideology, because it's just not socially acceptable to call yourself an autogynephile because of conversations like these on Joe Rogan. Because no one is going to watch this and be like, oh yeah, I totally want to start identifying as an autogynephile. That'll be totally a cool thing to do. I'll get so much clout on social media from identifying as an autogynephile. I mean, like, no, that's not gonna happen. Okay, well, I think that's it for me. I just really wanted to like react to this Joe Rogan thing and like give my 2 cents on this, because I like wanted to jump on this trend and like just get a video out there on this topic, because I'm sure like a lot of people are going to be like searching for this like on Google or whatever. I wanted to like kind of like quickly get in there, because I'm like hoping that like the algorithm finds channels like mine where I'm trying to educate people about the actual science of AGP, the actual research, or they look at like the interviews that I did with Dr. Ray Blanchard and Dr. Michael Bailey. I would love it if when people Google searched for autogynephilia, they found first thing, my interview with Dr. Ray Blanchard to clear up misconceptions, to clear up these common objections. Or they found Phil Illy's work, or they found his book, or they found his channel where he's interviewing AGPs, to sort of realize that AGP comes in a wide spectrum of clinical presentations. And like, yeah, like not all AGPs are creepy, perverted fetishists who like to walk around exposing their balls in miniskirts in New York City. So, all right. Well, that is it for me. Thanks for watching. Have a great night, guys. Take care. See ya.